Hey, welcome to another episode from Your Own Pathway Therapy Conversations. Here, we speak on the topics that we've been conditioned to stay quiet about and the ones that rock the boat. But here, nope, we're not protecting that silence, we're breaking it. So, you know what? Let's own it. So, I want to say happy Social Workers Month to all my social workers out there. It is March. March is Social Workers Month. And honestly, for someone who has not practiced as a social worker for a while now and has been on their own for a while now as someone who has their own business. I actually miss Social Workers Month and being around my social worker colleagues. So happy Social Workers Month to all my wonderful social workers out there. And if nobody has told you lately, you all do an amazing job. We all do an amazing job. And our work is so needed. And I get it. Sometimes it can be underappreciated. So this episode today is for my social workers out there and for any therapist who chooses to watch this. I also want to acknowledge my LMFT and my LPCs out there. And my next episode is actually going to focus on us, hopefully, and the skills that we have that is so underutilized. But for this episode, it is for my fellow social workers out there. So happy Social Workers Month. So when most people hear the term social worker, sorry, can't talk today, social worker, they often think about either therapy, case management, or community support. And yes, while those things are certainly part of our role and our work, the foundation of social work training is actually something much deeper. The thing is, social workers were trained to see systems. And as I was thinking about, I was thinking about this recently because I've been, again, out of school for almost 20 years now. Holy crap. Which is wild to say that out loud. But one of the first classes, and I think for anyone who's watching this who is social work trained, we go back to our our social work school, and one of our classes was human behavior in the social environment, which is called HIPSI. Yay, HIPSI. So we had HIPSI 1 and HIPSI 2. And it was one of the more challenging classes, not gonna lie. And I remember my professor standing at the whiteboard, yes, the whiteboard, drawing on an actual whiteboard in those simple times in the early 2000s. And in the middle of the board, she drew a circle. Inside the circle was a person. Then around that circle, she started drawing other circles or like kind of started doing a web. And I don't remember what that is called. Is it like a web? We're just gonna call it a web. So for anybody who remembers the correct terminology, please put it down in the description box. And so she labeled all the different systems around that person: family, school, work, community, church, relationships, culture, policy, all of that. And what she was showing us was the concept of person in the environment. Human behavior never exists in isolation. People are constantly interacting with systems around them. And that's why some of the advice that we hear in society doesn't always hold up. A lot of us go to school, go to work, have a life different from our home life versus like our public life. And so you'll hear things like leave your personal problems at home or don't bring work stress into your personal life. And yes, sure, people try to do that. They try to do that very hard. And the reality is that systems overlap. What happens in one system often shows up in another. For children, and for anybody who has children could probably speak this, and as a social worker slash therapist, for children, one of the first places you often see this shift in behavior is school. A teacher notices something is different or off, and maybe a student who used to participate becomes withdrawn. Maybe a student who was doing well suddenly starts struggling. And the question becomes, what's going on here? For adults, that place is often at work or at school. Okay, right, if you're an adult learning student. But for most of us, it's at work. So, maybe a manager might notice someone who used to perform well, suddenly seems overwhelmed or disengaged, or, maybe also seems withdrawn. Again, the question becomes, what's happening? And this is where the person in the environment perspective becomes incredibly powerful because instead of immediately assuming that the individual is the problem, social workers are trained to ask a different question. What system might be influencing this change in behavior? So, why are social workers trained to see organizational dysfunction? And for anybody who has been trained or went through social work school, I don't know about you all, but my professor always say, don't ever use the word dysfunction. And so in this instance, and in my work in consulting, I'm going to use the word dysfunction that co-aligns with misalignment. So why social workers see organizational misalignment. That's how I'm going to put it. So, as social workers, we are trained to look at human behavior through systems. So, what does that mean for us? It means that we start noticing patterns, not just in families or communities, but in organizations. Social workers are often in places where human systems collide, and this includes hospitals, schools, community programs, government systems, and nonprofits. So, over time, you begin to see how policies, leadership, decisions, and organizational structures impact real people. And something becomes very clear. Sometimes what looks like an individual problem is actually a systems problem. So, when we look at organizations, and especially let's look at an work organization. In almost every organization, the people closest to the ground, which are often the frontline workers, feel the dysfunction or the misalignment first. They feel the pressure. They see the inconsistencies. They notice the gaps between what leadership says and what actually happens in the day to day. Now, these frontline workers may not always have the language to describe it, but they feel it. And sometimes leadership is operating at a different level of the system. They're focused on strategy, budgets, metrics, or growth. So, yes, there can be a gap between what leadership believes is happening and what people inside the system are actually experiencing. So, why are social workers so so like fluent in systems? Because not just because of our education, it's also because of the work that we actually do every day. Beginning of my career, I worked in various systems, and I'm sure that a lot of you also worked in different systems initially too before you are where you are right now. And many of us begin our careers helping clients or patients connect with resources. And this is what we mostly are known for, is connecting resources for our clients. And that might mean navigating healthcare systems, housing systems, school systems, financial systems, community support programs, and often the social worker becomes the one coordinating all of this, which hence is like the case management. So we're not just helping the individual, we're helping them navigate multiple systems at the same time. And many of our clients, as we're given direction, we're advocating for them. Many times, our clients are doing exactly what they were told to do by all these various systems to try to receive services. You know what? They fill out the proper paperwork, they went to the appointment, they followed the instructions, and then they come back and say to you, you know what? I still cannot get the help that I need. So that's when you, the social worker, us, the social worker, like, okay, you know what? Let me know what's going on, what's happening, and I'll start digging to see what it is that are the barriers that are preventing you from getting what it is that you need. And so what do? You pick up the phone, you email, you start calling agencies, you start asking questions, and then you start learning about the policies. And that's when you begin to see the fractures between systems. One system may say, oh yes, the person definitely qualifies. We have the needed, information, the paperwork from them, so they qualify. And then you call the other agency that says, you know what, they don't qualify. And this is the reason why they don't qualify. And then, of course, through all this fracture, we've all had this. One department sends them somewhere else that had nothing to do with them, and another, department says this should never have been sent there in the first place. This is what they should have done. It's like, oh God. So it's like going on a wild goose chase, which is all the various systems that you're trying to chase. And so we we learn firsthand on what the fractures and misalignment are in the various systems and organizations, and trying to receive and trying to get the help that our clients need. So, I think it's so important for me to also share my story about being a social worker too. And, one of the hardest jobs I've ever had was being a hospital discharge planner. And for anybody who's ever worked in a hospital, especially a hospital discharge planner, I want to say we have one of the hardest jobs ever. And this job was so hard. And yet it is a job where I had the most growth, especially learning about systems. I remember when I worked in the hospital and I was on the surgical floor, short stay, which was the observation. I also did medical and internal medicine. And so, I had such a variety. And I remember when I worked in a hospital, especially doing inpatient, the doctors and the nurses would sometimes say to social workers, ugh, I could never do your job. And you know what? We would laugh and say the same thing back to them. We're like, "We could never do your job." So it was all it was all like, "We can't do your job, they can't do our job, and you know what? It all works, and that's why we're a team." But what they were noticing when they said, "I could never do your job," was what they were noticing was something very important. They saw how much of our work involved navigating systems. This included insurance systems, okay, this person doesn't have their 2 3 day Medicare stay, so they can't leave. So I mean, they have to private pay, or discharge planning. Oh, this place isn't ready to take them, and the hospital is saying that they're ready. So just the discrepancies in that, community resources, policy requirements, and many times the things that slow down care and discharge. And oftentimes it was not the medical treatment at all. It was the system that delayed it, or something that was related to policy system, some other, system that caused the whole delayed. So I want to talk about this, the macro, meso, and micro. So it's actually micro, meso, macro. So I went from down. And it's usually we talk about this like micro, meso, macro. In social work, we often talk about the systems again, the three levels: the macro, which is the policies and institutional structures; the meso, which often consisted of teams and organizational culture; and micro, which is the individual experiences. All three levels are constantly influencing each other. Organizations may try micro solutions, which we see a lot, especially in the workplace. We see this like they coach individuals, they do executive coaching, they update communication strategies, they offer resilience training. But the thing is, if the macro level system stays the same patterns often return. Why? Because people are still operating within the same structure, the same incentives, and the same pressures. And so I want to talk about the scientific side of social work. And when we think about science, when you social work, we don't ever think about science, but not true at all. We often overlook is that our field has a lot of strong scientific foundation in our training. We have courses. Again, I talked about the human behavior in the social environment, HIPSI. And where I got educated, we had HIPSI 1 and HIPSI 2. And HIPSI, human behavior in the social environment, is very much grounded in theory. And we were taught about the various different type of theories, such as person environment, the ecological systems perspective, strengths perspective, developmental frameworks. And especially in my graduate school, we learned a lot about the trauma informed approaches. And these models really help us as practitioners understand how human behavior interacts with systems. So, moving on, let's talk about some of those perspectives and frameworks that we learn about. And one of my favorite ones is the strengths perspective. So, as social workers, we are also trained not just to look for, problems or misalignment or quote unquote dysfunctions, again, which I reframed it as misalignments. We're also trained to look for strengths. And, one of the things when I work with people, I always ask, what are your strengths? And they've never, ever been asked that question. We always look at the maladaptive behaviors. We never look at someone, an individual strength or an organization's strengths at all. So when we look at strengths, we look at, okay, what resources already exist? And this includes internal and external, and what is already working inside that system. And this can include the individual, the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. What protective factors are already present in all of those systems? And so when we analyze a situation, we're looking at both the strengths of the system and the areas where there may be misalignment. Next, I want to talk about the psychosocial. I apologize. And in many ways, when social workers analyze an organization, we're doing something familiar or similar to a psychosocial assessment. The questions we ask: what is the history of the system? What pressures are shaping it? What strengths exist here already? And what are the stress points? Where might people be experiencing harm? It's almost like conducting, again, very much like a psychosocial assessment of an organization. And, sometimes this is accountability in systems. And when you start asking these questions, the conversation naturally moves into deeper territory. We're very trained at asking questions and then going deeper and deeper into the conversation. And oftentimes, it naturally comes out when you ask the right questions. So, when we're doing this, we're no longer just talking about individuals, we're talking about structures of accountability. You're talking about power. You're talking about alignment between values and actions. And you're also talking about responsibility within the system. Those are not always easy conversations for institutions or organizations to have, but they are necessary ones. So, to close off this episode, especially during Social Work Month, I want to mention that it's worth remembering something important about this profession. And this is for my social workers out there, or if you are someone from an organization who is not trained in social work, who is watching this. Social workers are often introduced as helpers. We all got into this field because we always say, "Oh, we want to help others," and this includes supporting individuals, families, and communities. But underneath that work is something deeper. Social workers are trained to understand how people and systems interact. We see how policies, we see leadership decisions and institutional structures and how they shape human experiences. And when you spend years doing this type of work, you begin to recognize patterns. No matter what system you go into, for someone like me who's been in this field for almost 20 years, I've worked in probably 7 different, systems, and I say this as a joke, but not really. You know how you hear people say, um, "Same same day, same old shit." And I've learned in working in various systems, I say this, "Same old, same old shit, different organization, different system." You see the patterns, you recognize the patterns, and you see how pressure moves through systems. You see where people are supported and where they are struggling. Social workers, no, we don't just help people navigate systems, we understand how systems shape people. And this is through power, accountability, alignment, and responsibility. And that perspective matters anywhere where human beings and institutions intersect. So that is all I have for this week's episode for Therapy Conversations. And this episode was a lot more candid because I feel like, Therapy Conversations is the platform where I get to be honest about being a clinically trained therapist and using the frameworks that we used, that we learn about in other systems. And so I hope this episode was helpful for especially my social workers out there to really honor us and show how we have so much skills that we may not realize how underutilized we are, and that we have a lot to give and to offer for other systems who may not understand it. And so, why are systems trained and being systems trained can be so useful and so could be helpful for other systems who may not see what we see. So, happy Social Worker Month. And again, this is your own pathway where therapy conversations are no longer silent and we finally own it. So, take care, stay safe, and I will see you all next time. Bye.